Hey guys, I'm on site about to install some crown molding, and I thought this was a great opportunity to share with you my favorite methods for splicing two pieces together. You see, this is necessary when the wall is longer than the crown molding available. Here in the US, we mostly have 16-foot crown molding, but this wall is 17 feet long, so I'm going to have to splice them together. This is called a scarf joint. In this video, I'm going to go over a few different methods for making this joint. The first method, and the one I chose for this job, is my favorite, and it's what I call the Pre-Fab method. That's what I typically choose when my crown is under 20 feet long. If it's over that, I'm usually going to make the joint while it's up on the wall. I'll discuss some of those additional methods towards the end of this video when I bring you back into the shop and we talk about a few other variations to this method. So stick around. As you see here, I'm setting up my chop saw with my simple crown molding jig. If you haven't seen my video on making this jig, I'll leave a link on the screen for you to check that out. It's really easy to make and gives great results. So let's go over the Pre-Fab method. This method requires that you're not in a huge rush and that quality is the most important parameter. If time is of the essence, which it often is, then you can jump to the end of this video and check out some of the faster methods, but this one just gives the best results. After setting up the jig and measuring my overall length for the wall, I started making some cuts. The angle is not super critical. Technically, the larger the miter angle, the larger the seam, and the larger the seam, the more surface area you have for glue, which can make the joint stronger, but it's a little harder to hide if it's a really long seam, so I like to go somewhere in the middle and use around a 30-degree angle. Here I'm using 31.6 degrees because that's the detent on the saw, which is a pretty standard angle. And this way I'll be able to easily return to that angle if I need to down the road. I like to cut both pieces of crown at the same time without adjusting the miter saw. That way I know I'll get the most accurate results. One piece is cut on one side of the blade and the other is cut on the other side of the blade. This pretty much guarantees a perfect fit. After cutting the crown, I needed a block for the back side. This is a critical piece because it's what holds the joint from cracking while you move it. It also significantly adds to the long-term strength of the joint. I like to cut a rip just from some scrap wood. Here I'm using a piece of a 2x4. It works great. Just make sure the piece will fit behind the crown so you're not fighting with it when you put it on the wall. I'll usually just sit the piece in the jig and try and slip the piece behind just to make sure that there's plenty of room. The next step is also an important one. I'm going to be using a thick, fast-setting epoxy with this glue. Anytime I'm using a thick epoxy, I like to remove some material at the joint so there's room for the adhesive. I always use my Dremel for this with some kind of wood shaping bit. It doesn't take much, I just want to rough up the surface and make a little room so I can squeeze the joint tight. Unlike traditional wood glues that require tight pressure for a solid bond, epoxy just needs to be in contact with both surfaces with very slight pressure. I also use the Dremel to remove some material on the back side where the strip of wood will be mounted. Epoxy will stick much better to the back of the trim if I remove the primer from the surface. Now it's time for the glue up. I always use a long straight edge for this process because it's very easy to think your trim is straight when you glue it up and then you put it on the wall and you can clearly see that it's crooked at the joint. So this level keeps me nice and straight. Then I mix up the epoxy and put it together. Make note of which side I glued up first. This is intentional. As you'll see when I add the second piece of trim, I like the second piece to tuck behind the first. I've just found that I get a tighter joint when I do it this way. Everything just lines up a little bit better. I clamp it up and I let the epoxy squeeze out. Then I use some denatured alcohol to wipe the surface. This will thin the epoxy to make it easier to remove so there's less sanding once it's dry. If you leave too much epoxy on the surface, you're likely to over-sand and make the joint stand out, which obviously we don't want. I would rather have to add a little bit of wood fill or epoxy later on if there wasn't enough, than leaving too much and having to over-sand it and it just looks terrible. Then I carefully moved the trim into the garage and left it to dry overnight with the clamps. The next day is time to sand. You can see on this particular piece, I did add a few nails. I don't normally do that, but I didn't have time to wait for the glue to start drying before I moved it. So I added a few nails for a little extra insurance. So now I'm just filling these holes with some simple wood filler. Then after a good amount of sanding with 120 grit sandpaper, I'm able to remove the primer coat and even out the joint. It's important to sand nice and wide so that you can blend the joint as much as possible. I add a quick coat of spray primer, leave it to set, then a little bit more sanding, and then one more coat of spray primer. And as you see, the joint is nearly invisible and it is super strong. Now I'm able to install my 17-foot piece of crown molding as if it came from the factory that way. As you see here, this is right after we put it up before we did any painting or anything. But one really important note, make sure you pick a good location for the scarf joint. Here I chose to go above the cabinets because it's darker over there, so you're even less likely to notice it. All right, we're back in the shop where I'm going to show you a few variations on the method you just saw. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know I love to make jigs. So I'm going to show you one of the jigs that I make for scarf joints. I just take a few straight pieces of scrap wood, lay one on top of the other, just like you see here. The idea is the same as what you saw earlier in the video with the level. Keep the pieces nice and straight while allowing room for clamping. Then I cut out the center section of the jig to leave room for the backer piece. I also make a small notch to make room for my clamp, which you'll see in a second. You don't have to make one of these on every job. If you make it big enough, you can reuse it for all different size moldings, job after job. Now let's talk about the other scenarios. Okay, let's say you're working with pre-finished crown molding. This is a much more difficult situation. I'm going to use 2 pieces of scrap crown just to demonstrate my process. This crown molding is not pre-finished, this is just pre-primed, so that's why it doesn't look like a glossy finish. I'm assuming you've already cut the molding and you're happy with the fit of the joint. Make sure to cut the overall length longer than you need. You'll cut it to final length once the larger piece is made. In this case, I would use standard wood glue instead of epoxy. I typically use Titebond. Any of their wood glues will work. I just use Titebond 3 because it gives you a little more working time. Instead of using the Dremel for the back piece, I would usually just sand the factory finish off with an aggressive sandpaper like 80 grit. I would leave the actual joint alone, no Dremel necessary like in the first method. Wood glue is thinner than epoxy and you want a flatter surface at that joint. The other advantage of standard wood glue is that you can clean it with water, it won't damage the finish, unlike the denatured alcohol I used earlier. What I'm doing here is intentionally overlapping further than is necessary so that when I apply the clamping pressure at the joint, it slides the glue and into position so that I can not open up the joint. If you line it up, then add the clamps, I find that it will open up the joint more than you want. I like these clamps that I'm using here because they're super lightweight and I can make them very, very, very light pressure because you don't want to over clamp this and cause it to shift out of position. I remove the clamps that are closest to the joint sooner when using wood glue, usually about an hour or so depending upon which wood glue you use, because I still have an opportunity to scrape some of that little bit of squeeze out before it fully sets up. I put the clamps back and leave them until tomorrow. The next day I'm going to use the touch-up crayon to fill the slight crack that might appear at the joint. These touch-up crayons usually come from the cabinet manufacturers. This is just intended to minimize the shadow line that appears and get it looking as seamless as possible. I will often use a hairdryer or very carefully a heat gun just to soften the crayon a bit to make it easier to work with. Then I'm going to use a white Scotch-Brite pad to remove any excess. I might repeat this process a few times until I'm happy with the look. Alternatively, I have used lightweight spackling compound and carefully worked it into the crack and then used the touch-up pen that comes with the kitchen cabinets to color the line. Either way works, just be careful, take your time, and you should be fine. All right, now let's go over a situation where your crown is much too long to prefab it on the ground and you have to install it in place. I'm going to show you how I install it up on the wall. Some guys will tell you just put it up, add some wood glue, and nail it together. The problem is that the joint really isn't that strong, so it's more likely to crack over time. So let me show you my method. The beginning starts out the same. I use epoxy for the backer piece and prep with the Dremel. You can use wood glue if you prefer. I just think epoxy is more reliable because, as I said earlier, wood glue needs much more clamping pressure than epoxy. I like to attach the backer with some 23 gauge pin nails and leave it to set for a bit. An important note, make sure you don't have any squeeze out at the joint from the backer piece. Otherwise, it might get in the way when you try and attach that second piece of crown. You want it room so that it can just tuck right in there. If the nails go through the back, no problem, just cut them or bend them out of the way so you don't hurt yourself when you put it up. Then I'll nail the first piece up on the wall. Again, pay attention to which piece I'm installing first. I want that second piece to tuck in between the backer piece and that angle of the first piece. If you don't have time to leave this to set, you can pretty much go almost immediately right to the next step. If you have some time to wait, let that epoxy set up, it's even better. Then I apply some more epoxy to the backer so it attaches to the second piece of crown. For the miter joint, again, I prefer epoxy because it sands better than wood glue and fills any small space in that joint. Then I'm going to nail the crown up with 18 gauge finish nails. Because I can't clamp this joint, I will also add a few 23 gauge pins right at the joint. After it's nailed in place, I'll use some denatured alcohol just to clean up the joint and wipe any excess epoxy. After a few hours, the epoxy is set and I can start to sand and prime just like method 1. So as you see, the overall process is pretty much the same for each method, the key component being that backer piece at the joint. The difference just comes in the prep work and the type of adhesive used. I know there are other ways to do this, but this is what I have found to be my favorite and most effective method for making a scarf joint that looks seamless. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much, guys. Hopefully I'll see you on the next one.